The girl and her brother hear heart-wrenching screams coming from their mother's bedroom. Ever since they could remember, that sound had lingered in their hearts like a nightmare. Even though their mother had already given birth to 8 children, 4 of them had died one after another for various reasons. Yet not long afterward, their 45-year-old mother risked her life and gave birth to a pair of twin boys again. The reason was that their authoritarian and hot-tempered father was a farmer who owned a vast amount of land. He hoped the family would have as many children as possible, and he never cared about his wife's health. And the way the father treated his 3 sons was also extremely rough. As long as the eldest son will talked back to him even once, he would be dragged to the stable and severely punished with a leather whip. Chris, as the only girl in the family, seemed to receive slightly looser discipline from her father, but this was not because of favoritism. It was because Chris had been obedient and sensible since childhood. Her grades were excellent, and she was often praised by teachers at school, which made her father feel very proud. Going to school every day became the happiest part of Chris's life. Here, she could relax and chat with her best friends, laugh and play freely. Only when she left her father's sight could she reveal her lively and sunny side. After returning home from school, Chris would do whatever she could to help her mother with the housework, but as soon as her father appeared, he would pour all the emotions he had built up outside onto them. Chris could only release these frustrations through writing in her diary, allowing her heart to find some relief. Chris had always carried a dream of becoming a teacher. After graduating from middle school, her teacher even came to their house to persuade her father, hoping Chris could continue studying at a university in the city instead of staying at home every day and letting her talent go to waste. But her father dismissed the teacher with the excuse that too much education brought no benefit to a girl. That very night, her mother quietly walked into Chris's room and stood behind her daughter for a long time. Chris noticed that her mother's mental state looked very poor, and she hurried forward and held her tightly in her arms.
Have I vexed you?
Oh, not you, Chris. Just life. I cannot tell you a thing nor advise. You'll need to face men for yourself. When the time comes, there's no one can stand and help you. Mind that for me sometime, if I cannot suffer it longer.
The next day, they discovered that their mother had taken poison and passed away, leaving this world together with the newborn twins. Will and Chris understood that their mother could no longer endure their father's torment and had chosen this path, yet they were powerless to change any of it. Just after their mother's funeral ended, Chris's aunt hurried over. The aunt worried that the 2 young nephews would be affected growing up in such an environment, so she took the 2 little boys away overnight. Meanwhile, Chris and Will remained in their hometown and continued helping their father manage the farmland. From that moment on, Chris lost her dream and became a true village girl, working in the fields every single day. During the busy autumn harvest season, when their father could not handle all the work, he would temporarily hire laborers to help with the farming. But the father, who had no sense of empathy at all, firmly refused to let the workers enter their house. He arranged for the workers to live in the cowshed, and all 3 meals every day were delivered by Chris. Unfortunately, when those crude country laborers saw the young and beautiful Chris, they often tried to touch her inappropriately, but Chris would not endure it like her mother did. She would rise up and fight back immediately. As Chris grew older, she became more and more graceful and beautiful, and many men in the village began paying attention to her. Well-educated and refined, every smile and every glance from Chris carried elegance, which made those men desire her even more. But in Chris's eyes, there was room for only one person, the young man named Ewan. Ewan appeared very gentlemanly, and likewise, he had secretly been in love with Chris for a long time. Before long, Ewan finally gathered the courage to confess his feelings to Chris. At the same time, her brother Will, who had already grown into an adult, no longer wanted to stay in this home that held no warmth. He told his father and Chris that he was about to leave for the distant land of Siberia. When the father heard that his son was leaving home, he did not say a single word to persuade him to stay. He simply turned around and walked out of the room. Chris begged her brother to take her with him, but her brother knew very well that wandering into the unknown meant a future filled with uncertainty. Will remained silent, and Chris instantly understood the helplessness in his heart. She reminded her brother not to miss the carriage. After quickly packing his luggage and walking downstairs, they said their reluctant goodbyes. Chris stood by the window, watching the only person in this world who loved her disappear from her life. The always strong girl suddenly burst into tears, crying so hard that she could barely speak. Throughout the entire winter, there was no news from Will at all. No one knew whether in the harsh Siberian winter there was even a single warm place where he could escape the freezing cold. The cold and heartless father also received the punishment for everything he had done. One day, while working, the father suddenly collapsed to the ground, and Chris rushed over after hearing the noise and tried to help him up. Yet the stubborn old man was still cursing and refused his daughter's help. Even so, Chris still went to find a doctor. The doctor told Chris that her father had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage which could leave him permanently paralyzed, and even the doctor was powerless to change it. Chris did not feel sorrow because of this. Instead, she let out a long breath of relief. But after all, Chris carried her father's blood in her veins, so she took on the responsibility of caring for him. Chris handed a whistle to her father, hoping that he could blow it whenever he needed help. But the father did not take the whistle. Instead, he suddenly grabbed Chris's hand and spoke to her.
"In my flesh and blood, do with you what I will."
Those words filled Chris with overwhelming fear. She left her father's room, and hearing his furious shouting from the bedroom, her heart could not calm down for a long time. Struggling with all his strength, the father climbed down from the bed, and Chris could hear from outside the door that he was slowly moving toward the doorway step by step. Chris decisively locked the door from the outside. The next day, Chris called one of her father's friends over and calmly told him that her father had died during the night. At the farewell ceremony, Chris did not shed a single tear. Her aunt hoped that she would give her father a final goodbye kiss, but Chris simply turned around and left the memorial. After her father's death, Chris suddenly became a wealthy woman and inherited all of his property. A new light suddenly appeared in her eyes. The relationship between her and Ewan also grew deeper as they spent more time together. Chris told her aunt the news that she wanted to marry Ewan. Her aunt also hoped that her lonely niece would have someone to take care of her, so she did not oppose the relationship. After staying with Chris for a few days, the aunt left the farm. Not long after, ignoring the advice of others, Chris spent a large amount of money to hold a lavish wedding for herself and Ewan in the second month after her father's death. Chris firmly believed in her own judgment. She believed Ewan would bring her steady happiness and that she would never repeat her mother's misfortune. Even though Ewan was completely penniless, she did not care in the slightest. They spent an extremely beautiful honeymoon together. Ewan worked diligently and helped Chris manage the estate. Although life was simple, under the nourishment of love, Chris felt incredibly satisfied. This was exactly the beautiful marriage she had imagined. Whenever Ewan left for short trips, Chris missed him every single moment. By this time, they already had the fruit of their love. Pregnancy and childbirth were a nightmare for her mother, but for Chris they were a source of immense happiness. Ewan also often cared for his wife and did not want the pregnant Chris to overwork herself. Several months later, after enduring 2 days and 2 nights of labor pains, Chris safely gave birth to a baby boy, and they named him Little Ewan. But just as the happy life of their family of 3 had begun, the First World War suddenly broke out. Many young men in the village gradually received notices calling them to the front lines. Chris and Ewan did not want to lose the hard-earned happiness they had found, but they had no power to stop the war. Half a year later, one of Ewan's friends told them that he had also received a notice for military physical examination and had come specially to say goodbye. They both knew that once he left, no one could be sure if they would ever meet again. In the days that followed, Chris and Ewan lived in constant anxiety every day, afraid that the notice might arrive at their home at any moment. That spring felt unbearably long for them, but just after the planting season ended, Ewan was still summoned to the town for a meeting. He thought he would return home after the meeting, yet once he left, there was no news from him again. Until the harvest season arrived in autumn, Chris still had not seen her husband return. Fortunately, that year's harvest was exceptionally good, and they stored enough grain to last for several years. Just like that, 3 years passed. On an ordinary morning, Ewan returned home reeking of alcohol, but his young son had no memory of his father at all. After experiencing the brutality of war, Ewan's personality had changed drastically. There was not the slightest warmth in their reunion. Using a commanding tone, Ewan forced Chris to do this and that for him. Not only that, he constantly demanded money from Chris so he could go to town and drink heavily. Chris could not understand why the gentle and loving husband she once knew had turned into someone like her father in just 3 short years. Facing her husband's rough behavior, Chris did not obey blindly like her mother once did. She bravely confronted Ewan. A few days later, Ewan packed his luggage and prepared to return to the front lines again. Before leaving, he deliberately stood at the door smoking a cigarette, looking at his wife with extremely complicated emotions, then let out a long sigh without saying goodbye to Chris. They stood with their backs to each other, and Ewan walked away calmly, slowly leaving behind his home and his wife and child. Chris pretended not to care about her husband's departure. but inside her heart was bleeding. 2 months later, Chris received the news that Ewan had died on the battlefield.
Oh, what do I do? What do I do? It's a lie! It's a lie! It's a lie! It's a lie!
In the days that followed, Chris tried her best to control the grief, yet she still missed Ewan deeply, until Ewan's friend returned from the front line and finally told Chris the truth. After witnessing the cruelty of war and seeing countless comrades die around him, Ewan's mental state had become extremely fragile. His desire to return to his family grew stronger and stronger. He knew very well that he might lose his life at any moment, so without receiving permission he secretly left the battlefield and returned to his hometown to see Chris and their son. At the same time, he had already prepared himself to face the severe punishment for leaving the battlefield without approval. In order to ensure that after losing him Chris would not spend the rest of her life in endless pain, he deliberately pretended that his personality had completely changed, hoping to make Chris disappointed in him so that she could find another man to accompany her in the future. After learning the truth, Chris felt overwhelming regret for the way she had treated Ewan. Even their final farewell had passed without a single embrace between them. The two people who loved each other were now separated forever between life and death.